Hello and welcome to the Beacon Podcast. Beacon is a project of the Maine People's Alliance, and you can subscribe and find past episodes at mainbeacon.com or some kind of podcasting application. I'm Mike Tippin, Communications Director for MPA. With me is MPA Senior Organizer Esther Pugh and Deputy Director Ben Chin. Good to see you both. Hey.
Yeah, good to see you.
What's up, Great T-Shirt Club? How's everybody doing? Got the celebration flavors all out, I see.
Gray's a celebration flavor. I do enjoy. It is now, I guess.
That's right.
So we are going to talk a little bit about celebrating the election that just happened, but then more about the vicious infighting that has followed the election. Can't allow ourselves to be too happy. There's a lot that is rebounding right now after Tuesday's results, or I guess we should say Saturday's final results here. And we're seeing things happen in Maine, including the legislature get themselves in order, leadership elections, jockeying for constitutional officer positions. We're going to talk more about that. But I think today what we're going to talk a little bit more about is how people won, how people lost. There's a lot of a national conversation right now about progressivism and what happened in the House and in the Senate and in the presidency. And I think that's going to be most of our focus today.
What I'd like to most do is cherry pick election results that sort of confirm biases I had going into the election to just prove that I was right about everything all along. So that's what I'm planning on doing today.
I think that'll be most of what we're doing.
Yeah. Cool.
Just okay with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think it's really important to recognize that. Like, we are obviously progressives. We have some deeply held beliefs and values that we want to advance. That doesn't necessarily mean that the best way to win is always to hold those values and express them fully in all situations at all times. I think often it does, and I think we'll get into that, but there obviously can be a difference there and a divide. So I think it's important as we begin to recognize that.
I feel like I'm going to learn something today.
Well, I was going to say that the place for me that was most provocative was opening up the email to read the New York Times Daily Brief, I think it was, where they just led with this very straightforward argument around, hey, look, Biden overperformed all these House Democrats, including some very progressive ones that won. Therefore, Biden had the better strategy. He was the only person who could have won the presidential election. If he had been an inch more progressive, he would have lost and Donald Trump would have won. And so, they had some caveats in there. They were talking about some of the progressive ballot measures that won, but it was interesting to me that for the New York Times, perhaps unsurprisingly, that was a starting point for how they were analyzing the election.
Yeah, and I think there's some truth to that. There were progressives that ran behind Biden in the same districts. I think Ilhan Omar, might have been a bunch of points behind him in Minnesota. And then, of course, we see the numbers on the other side. One thing that AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has been talking about is that all the Democrats in the swing districts that supported Medicare for all won. And many of those who didn't. So I think there's a bit of a confluence of events there, and those numbers are not quite as easy to analyze in a straightforward way.
The thing that I'm thinking about is, like, I keep reading all of these articles and these opinion articles and these pieces that talk about how doesn't matter that, like, Biden is pretty moderate, but he still got labeled as a socialist and as a progressive and as somebody who was going to do all of these things by the right, which, like, even if he would still be called that, even if he was really, really progressive. It's like the right and Republicans like to use the term socialist as a dirty word, and, like, yeah, I care about giving people healthcare. I care about making sure people have enough money to buy food and put it on their table, and to get paid enough. And I'm repeating myself, but, like, I I just think it's so funny that that's the argument that is used regardless of where you stand on that spectrum of Democrat or liberal or progressive, that you get labeled as a socialist just because you are a Democrat, which Biden is not.
Right. I mean, and if you know those attacks are going to happen anyway, is the answer to that to lean into it, to put your values out there, to say what you really stand for? Or is it to play defense on those and say, no, I don't support that, as we saw Sarah Gideon and others do, no, I don't support defunding the police, in some ways repeating the attack against you. In addition to the House that we've talked about, all of the Senate Democrats ran behind Biden as well. And the big strategy there, and this is something that was talked about during the campaign, is that they really tried to run to the middle more and tried to not offend people, really tried to run against Trump and against McConnell. And, in a lot of ways, they tried that tactic, and it also didn't work in that way.
I just see that as feeding into everyone else's messaging rather than like creating your own or paving your own way. I'm not an expert on messaging, but that's what I'm seeing as an organizer, at least.
Well, I'd like to talk about that more in terms of the Senate race in a moment in Maine, because I think there are some interesting dynamics there that relate to that. But let's talk about some Maine numbers first in a couple of local places. So I think you could pick just about any town in Maine and get some interesting numbers and learn some lessons from them. But I picked two that I found interesting because there were some big differences. One was Rockland. And I bet you guys can guess why I picked this one. But Biden won Rockland with 62%. So pretty good numbers for the presidential candidate. Pingree won with 67%. So progressive, first congressional district champion, 5 points ahead. Gideon only got 51%. And, she would have had to pick up a lot more support in places like Rockland if she was going to win it. The state rep and the candidate for state house won with 57 and 59%. So we've been running behind Biden a bit there. And then a $15 minimum wage, which I think we'll have to look this up, but makes Rockland one of the smallest jurisdictions in the country, perhaps the smallest to have that high a wage, won with 66% of the vote. So Pingree and the minimum wage are what carried Rockland, and everyone else was trailing behind. The same exact voters, often the same issues that we're talking about here. Pingree and Biden are going to be fighting for a lot of the same stuff on the federal level.
Yeah, and I think one of the contours that make sense to point out in explaining some of those differences is the fact that all of those folks that you named had different opponents. So Biden, one could argue, was running against a historically weak opponent. I mean, who had crashed the national economy, mishandled a major crisis. I mean, you can just kind of go down the list. Gideon, on the other hand, was running against a very strong opponent. I mean, a senator that started off in an extremely popular position and had way further to go down than Trump did, for example. And that's just more work. That's just a much steeper hill to climb. And you can go through that for the down ticket races as well. So, I mean, I think that's one thing to keep in mind that makes the apples and oranges comparison a little bit difficult, because it's not like everybody's run against generic conservative ideology, except perhaps for the minimum wage referendum. There's actual people with little differences and idiosyncrasies. That said, I do think that a strong argument for the case that you were making, Esther, in terms of messaging and the value of not reinforcing what the opposition's doing, is there are because the opposition varies year to year, we are going to win some races and we're going to lose some races. And so in the long term, there's a question of, if you are running for office, what will help other candidates beside yourself build a narrative that sort of lifts all boats and helps everybody win? And if you run on, hey, I'm just this unique, interesting person, by definition, that's not going to help anybody else, right? It won't even help you in the future, perhaps. But if you do run to make an argument around issues and a progressive narrative and worldview and ideology, that does help to associate a broader set of people with these issues that are clearly popular and winning over a lot of folks that aren't being won over in different ways. And so it's not that that's going to always win everybody everything, but it is a question of like, yeah, hey, what can we all do to kind of help each other out over the long run here? And it seems like that's a pretty reasonable thing to ask candidates to do.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys will forgive me, I've really avoided using a lot of woodworking metaphors, despite the fact that it's my current obsession. But it's something I've been thinking a bit about with this election. You know, when you're doing that kind of, making things, there's a lot of different ways you can approach it. Like if you're cutting a groove in a board called a dado, you could use a dado stack, which is a bunch of blades together. You could use one blade and do a bunch of passes. You could use a router and use this little spinning blade. You could use a handsaw and a chisel. I'm getting way outside.
What else could you use, Mike? Are there other things?
My allowance of woodworking analogy here, but all of those work, and there's arguments over what's most efficient, but it really comes down to what you're comfortable with and what tools you have, like literally what tools are available to you and what you have the ability and knowledge of. And I think there's a lot of that in terms of campaign mechanics. There's a lot of ways to win. If you're an incumbent with a moderate profile and everyone knows you as the local football coach, like you have different tools available to you as a young upstart progressive in a district that's trying to do things in a different way. But that's like very much the mechanics of it, like of winning that one election. And as you say, Ben, it's about bringing other people along. It's about winning in a bigger way. Like that's a very narrow view of winning. Progressives want to win policy victories. We want to advance a movement for change. And even if you win an election in a narrow way, even if you win the election, that's good. And you can advance things in that way, but maybe not in the same way you can. And as you say, it's also a short-sighted view. It's not doing necessarily the deep conversations or the deep canvassing, the challenging of racism, the building of hope, which I think in a lot of these areas that we talk about with quote unquote working class white people, like is the only way to stop the slide towards that kind of conservatism and totalitarianism.
I am thinking about all of the issues across the country that won, like the progressive issues that won the $15 minimum wage in Rockland and in Portland, all the other races that won in Portland, Florida raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which is amazing. And then again, splitting and voting for Donald Trump for president, marijuana passing in multiple states, and some places taxing the rich. So just like it's really issue-based things that folks come out and strong. And you've heard AOC say that a bunch. And we saw that with a lot of other races across the country as well, people who came out strong on a lot of these issues. And I think that that's a good lesson for folks when looking back on the 2020 election is like, if I came out in strong in support of raising wages and providing healthcare and providing childcare, like, what does that mean for we're about to start another election cycle soon. What does that mean for 2022 and 2024? I think that there will be some lessons that come out of the 2020 election that'll help some of these quote unquote moderate Democrats maybe realize like, oh, maybe I should be a bit more progressive, or these progressive folks who have been like saying that being told that they have to keep themselves down to actually like speak out and say what they truly feel and win, because we're showing that that's how you win, is by talking about these issues, the real issues that impact real people.
The other thing that's probably worth saying, and perhaps this is a bit of a transition to the next topic, is without the pandemic, there's no way any good stuff would have happened. I mean, probably the referendum would have been fine, but imagining what it would be like for Trump to go in with a historically strong economy, no national crisis that he bungled, it just seems really clear to me he would 100% be sitting in the Oval Office. And so the the main question that leaves me is, we're not going to win just by winning little demographics by a few points here or there. For us to truly have national power to really pass the policies we need, particularly through the Senate, we have to win with a lot more people, with a lot bigger margins. And what's it going to take to get to that level? And it does seem like really being able to articulate that bigger picture vision is an essential ingredient to that.
Yeah. And in a lot of ways, it's not either or. We need to reach out to voters in the middle at the same time as we grow the number of people that are turning out and that are energized. And so we have to find a way to do both, without turning off one or the other. One other set of numbers I just want to share with you guys and get your reaction. In Fort Kent, so this was a town, a little different. Trump won this. Biden got 47%. Gideon got 36%, which is low, but not bad for, this being somewhat near Caribou, which is her ancestral home. Golden got 57%. Jackson got 62%, the state Senate, and Martin in the state house got 60%. So I found that interesting. Top of the ticket, Republicans won. Congress on down, Democrats won by, approaching 10 or 20 points there. I guess the difference is 20 points. Yeah.
Yeah. And that seems to me another great example of, it does seem like certainly Jackson has this other tool in his toolkit, some little saw he pulled out to cut a piece of wood of, economic populism. And he had a little bit of a theory on how he's going to say to voters, yeah, you might not agree with the whole feel of the ideological left, but at the end of the day, you get that I'm on your side. I'm going to stand up with you against big corporations and rich interests. And that is certainly a way of getting the middle that is not just, hey, let's just compromise everything we believe in all the time. That's how you get swing voters, and right. It's cool to see folks out there who are trying to figure that out.
I think that photo of him wearing the Bulls hat in the 90s and standing on the barricade, keeping the Canadian loggers out of the county, is worth about 5 points in any election. So
definitely.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we've talked a lot about these things in kind of general terms. One other point I want to make before we talk about the Senate race is that there are some interesting numbers around voter registration that we saw over the last few months. Republicans were actually winning on that, getting more people. I think, that was the big difference between 2018 and 2020, is that in 2018, Democrats turned out. In 2020, Democrats turned out, and also Trump got Republicans out. And he wasn't on the ballot in 2018. I think that's another element of this too. But he and his campaign were registering people at a high rate, and Democrats didn't match and exceed that until George Floyd and the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement really energized people. And then Democrats and progressives and young people started registering to vote. And I think that's an important thing to remember as well.
Yeah.
Those are some powerful, I'm just like thinking about where I was in those moments. I mean, and where the young folks that I was working with Maine Student Action were thinking about registering young folks. And yeah, that timeline that you were just talking about really makes a lot of sense from what I've seen and what I've heard from talking with folks who are in college or who are newly 18, or even folks who are under 18 who obviously can't and couldn't vote, but were pushing their fellow over 18-year-olds to do so.
All right, let's talk about the Collins-Gideon race. Was Bill Green the deciding factor here?
I did have him marked down as a reason why when I'm having a conversation with my friends out of state about why Susan Collins won.
It's hard to explain who Bill Green is and why he might have impacted the race, but yeah.
They were like, a well-known what was the reason? And I was like, yeah. So
people think he's Stephen King or Angus King.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in all seriousness that this is, I think, a good example of both how difficult it can be to just beat up tough opponent, And I think Gideon deserves a huge amount of credit for getting as far as she did. And Alec at Maine State Employees Association had a great frame that he used around. This was the best accountability campaign he's ever been a part of, because I think it really showed how the people of a state can shift politics when particularly a couple key votes go the other way. And I also think it's definitely true that it's hard to think that was a perfect campaign, and if you hadn't made just a tweak or two here or there, that could have gotten you a couple more points to get it across the finish line, And I think a lot of people will have ideas on what those could be. And from my mind, it's at least worth mentioning that I don't know if Gideon had a super strong theory on CD2, white working class folks, and how to make a connection there. Certainly whatever theory there was there didn't really add up, given how hard it was for her to perform, as well as even just other down ticket candidates that often had good opponents they were running against too. So, I would think there's a little bit something to maybe consider about what does it take to actually show a real commitment to economic justice, where you've got that argument that you can make about being on people's sides. And for whatever reason, I'm sure that didn't come across as strong as it could have. I also was struck by someone commenting that, after all these ads I've seen of her, I just don't know that much about her. And, that's interesting, because I think there were quite a few ads that were, the talking points in them were good, and I'm sure they tested well in the polls. But yeah, what do you feel like you really know at the end of the day about kind of core convictions? I could see with so much negative advertising, it's hard to communicate that at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. I will, first, I see our topic is public polling. I will say I have not trusted a poll since 2016. So, and I think I said that like multiple times on this podcast. You probably could like go back every single podcast we talk about polling. I'm like, don't trust them. And then I think about, I remember hearing someone talking about something called like shy Trump voters. And there's people who will refuse to tell you who they're going to vote for, or will say that they're voting for not Trump and then go and vote for him. And I wonder if either the same or similar things happened with the Senate race in Maine. And then just like from my own experience working with our interns, fellows, volunteers who were calling and talking to voters and asking folks where they stood on the US race, like a lot of people did not want to disclose to us who they were voting for. So, and I've seen that echoed in a lot of like articles that were written about like, why were the polls so wrong? People didn't want to talk about who they were going to vote for. And beyond that, like, Democrats or people to the left are more likely to want to talk about who we're going to vote for. And while a lot of folks who are further to the right might not want to, because they get labeled a racist or other words that they're like, I'm not that. So there's just like a few things that plus Bill Green that pop into my mind when thinking about why things went the way they did and why polling said that what it did say.
Yeah, I think that's very right. I think that historically has been called the shy Tory effect. I think it started with Margaret Thatcher outperforming her polls. But it's interesting to me that seemed to have less of an effect on the Trump race than the Senate one. And so obviously there are some other factors as well going on there. The Senate race is where they really messed up on the polling. We didn't put out a public poll, or MPRC didn't this time, so we can be more critical without having to defend ourselves. But I will say, in terms of self-criticism, 6 years ago, we put out a poll that was about middle of the pack at the time, but was also pretty off on that Senate race, with Collins outperforming it. So I think the only reason it wasn't as big of an issue then is because she won by so much, and so it didn't matter if we had her ahead by 10 or by 30. But there are some definite difficulties that with polling nationally and especially in Maine. And it seems like there were a lot of firms that had a lot of problems. I think part of it is, people not wanting to say who they're voting for. It might be kind of a New England privacy thing, that maybe there's some kind of extra effect there. I think, diminishing response rates and all the other problems with polling and trying out the different modes of online and cell phone and mixed mode stuff, we're still figuring all that out too. But it's definitely something that we need to wrestle with more.
Yeah, I know that I got polled a few times, and I like gladly talk to those folks, and I think they hate me because they'll ask me a question, and then I'm like, "We have ranked choice voting. Why are you asking this question this way?" And they're like,
Right.
"Please, just give me an answer. Just pick something." And then I'm like, "I need to be nicer." So I'm probably the worst person for those pollsters to talk to. So if anyone's listening who polled me, I'm sorry.
There you go.
And speaking of 6 years ago, one other little counterfactual to try on you guys. I know one of the folks who works for the U.S. Senate Democrats who met both Shenna Bellows when she was running 6 years ago, and then met Gideon when she was running this time around. This person had some really good things to say about just how impressed they were over Shenna. And not that they had anything against Gideon, but there was a real spark that Shenna had when she ran against Collins all those years ago. And I don't know if you guys remember that walk across Maine that she did, but that to me was another little theory of like, oh,
which
how do you
stole from several Republican candidates that did that before her.
That's right. And it's just another example of like, oh, this is just a little theory. Like it's kind of a stunt. This is how you connect with people in rural Maine. You walk through their towns and talk to them and make a big deal about it. And I'm not saying Shenna would have won necessarily this time around, but it to me was a good reminder on there are interesting little tricks that people can experiment with and try to get creative with. And in a race as close as that, who's to say they wouldn't have made a difference?
Well, I think that's important to say that because of the pandemic, a lot of those things were closed off to a challenger. Like, I think shutting things down, maintaining the status quo, obviously that helps an incumbent, especially a 24-year incumbent. And we can talk about how there's more that Gideon could have done to define herself on values, to be like prepared and defend herself against those kind of attacks that we knew were coming. But she was facing an institution in this state, someone that until a few months ago was dearly beloved in all the polling. And she got the biggest decrease in Collins's vote share, of any, I'm sure, Senate candidate in the country from 6 years ago. Like, the work that everyone did to hold Collins accountable, and Gideon included, really made a difference there. It just wasn't quite enough of one. Mm. All right. From that good news, let's go to just a quick update on the COVID situation in Maine. So, long story short, things are not looking good. We now have had, I think, 3 or 4 days in a row where it's nearly every day a new record in cases, now over 200 in one day. Hearing from a lot of people that it's really touching their lives and their friends and their families. That is scary. But on the other hand, we just got some good news from Pfizer, of all people, not someone we usually turn to for good news, giant pharmaceutical corporation. But their vaccine looks like it's effective. So this is not peer reviewed, but they have put out results of a 90% efficacy rate, which is wonderful. And it looks like that is on track to be distributed to at least some portion of the population starting in December and January. So how are things looking to you guys in Maine?
How are we looking? Well, my brain went to how Contagion passed out the vaccine in the movie.
The movie Contagion.
The movie Contagion. I know it's been a while since I've talked about Contagion, and I haven't watched it in a while. I feel like I should rewatch. But what I remember that they did, it was on a lottery system. And basically it was like by birthday. So they like pulled every single birthday out of a hat, and then they were like in order from that. So that it wasn't based on like capitalism and who can pay more. But I know that there's obviously, I don't think that in Contagion they had to like keep the vaccine in these certain storage containers like as needed for these, which is a lot harder when it comes to getting it out to rural areas and folks who might have difficulty traveling. So there's all these other factors that go into making sure folks in Maine are going to be able to access the vaccine, especially in such a rural state where transportation is an issue and like roads are an issue, especially in December or January when it's going to be snowing, hopefully snowing. I'm praying, I'm hoping for snow, which is not in character for me, but hopefully by then we'll have snow.
Yeah, and that's something Beacon reporter actually, Evan Pop, asked Dr. Shaw about yesterday on his briefing was, are there plans to increase our ability to transport and store this vaccine that needs to be super cold right up until it's used? And he was saying that's the kind of logistical challenge that they've been looking for. They're working on it, which is, I guess, what you want to hear. But that it's really going to be a thing where they're going to have it at hospitals in certain areas, and people are going to come to it. And apparently the people that are going to get it first are those frontline healthcare workers that are in most need of it.
Yeah, I am very heartened by the other pieces in that article about health officials saying they want to make sure this is free for every American. So I think this is common sense. Everybody should get this because nobody should die from COVID. And if some people don't have it, it increases the likelihood that other people's will, because we're all in this together. It would be great if that kind of common sense policymaking around public goods spread to other issues besides just this vaccine, because truthfully, it applies to every single thing about public health and healthcare. That anytime you commodify something in our healthcare system or education system or transportation system or anything like that else, it has all these unintended consequences of making things bad for everybody else in a longer term sense. So that was good to see. The other thing that I wish I could see more of, I was doing a little bit of trolling on Twitter this morning around this, was just a little bit, as you do, just a little bit of perspective around how the cold weather increasing our count right now for COVID is not just an act of God, that there are plenty of other places near and far from us where the weather is getting colder and they're not seeing these kind of spikes. I know, Mike, you're always enjoy talking about our neighbors to the north, New Brunswick. So, the fact that
highest tides in the world.
Yeah. And
in terms of COVID. Okay.
Yeah. And, we are having over the course of a few days, the number of COVID cases they've had total, and they've had a pretty good public health approach, and they have this little bubble that they're in, and as a consequence, they are mostly open and their economy is doing fine. And then you can look at really urban countries like South Korea, where they're just not having a big spike right now. And again, they're wearing masks, but for the most part, it is normal life and they have this thing contained. And so I think the sad thing to me when you start hearing about these, caveats around the vaccine, like, well, it's only going to be for so many people to start with, and the logistics, it's like, oh man, this is the same place we've been all along, where other countries, you just had this feeling, other countries have really taken this seriously, are really making the investments, and we have some low standards. And that's honestly probably the biggest part of the problem on why we are where we are right now.
Well, I'm glad you at least started that bit of conversation by saying you were heartened by something. Even if we ended there, maybe let's keep that thread going and talking about some rays of hope, things that we're finding heartening in the world right now.
Mm-hmm. I can kick it off. Just like Ben, I was scrolling on Twitter this morning, but I was not trolling. I was just scrolling. And I came across a trending topic about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I was like, what is happening?
I saw this, yeah.
And it just got me really excited because I learned that Stacey Abrams is a huge Buffy fan. And she was interacting with folks about who's Buffy's best partner was. Was it Spike or was it Angel? And then someone brought in Riley when they're like, get out of here with that Riley crap. And for anyone who's never watched Buffy, they're like, what is happening right now?
Riley was the worst.
Yeah, Riley was the worst. And I have the direct tweet that Stacey Abrams shared. And she said that Angel was the right boyfriend for Buffy coming into her power. And Spike was the right man for her to be with as she became the power. And I was like, that just kind of summed up all of my feelings about the Buffy Spike Angel love triangle argument or debate. And also, I just love that I can look up to a politician for more than just having amazing political beliefs and amazing organizing skills, and also loving one of my favorite shows.
And I saw Joss Whedon retweeted that and agreed with it. So
yeah,
I think
also
that's
green
canon
shirt
now.
guy. You know, remember green shirt guy who was like filmed laughing at a Trump supporter during his town meeting? Like, he was also in that conversation too. So it's like all these amazing folks.
There you go. One interesting thing about Buffy and about Spike, Maggie always, my wife always calls Spike George W. Bush, because early in the series he's seen as like the big bad guy, right?
Yeah,
it's like the most evil possible, this bad vampire, and then after a couple seasons he's a puppy dog, and there's always someone worse, right?
mm-hmm.
There keeps being a worse bad guy, and it reminds me when we used to think George W. Bush was the worst it could get.
Oh my god.
Yeah,
just to bring it back to politics.
That's it. Well, I'll go next. So recently,
what Buffy related ray of hope do you have?
Yeah. Well, to the extent that Buffy is about the ancient demonic forces that plague our world, I have an ancient philosophy that I've been investigating, Stoicism. So just finished A Guide to the Good Life by William Irving. And the reason why I felt like this might be timely is so much of the roller coaster that has been the last week or so has been about perception, and so much about Stoic philosophy is about changing the frames by which one views the world. So it's not about just like embracing everything that is hard and never having fun, or anything like that. It's about little visualization exercises that I found pretty profound, where you just imagine, they call it negative visualization, where you just take something that you would normally take for granted and imagine what your life would be like without it. So some of the more profound things are when they have to do with relationships, like your spouse, like your kids, like your closest friends, and the people that you tend to just on a daily basis not really think much about unless there's something really extraordinary that happens, either good or bad. And I think particularly with all the ups and downs of the election, it's been meaningful for me to really kind of look the people in the eye who I've been relying around in this quarantine, in this pandemic, and just be like, wow, could not imagine my life otherwise. And honestly, that goes to coworkers at MPA as well, because just to heart going out to you, but in all seriousness, I think one of the big consolations for me in all these elections that we've been together through is just that I'm going to work with the same great people before election days after, and knowing that we'll just face whatever challenges come together is something that means a lot and puts some of the bad things in the easier perspective.
I think that's great, Ben. And that's kind of one of my favorite things about Stoicism. Like, as a philosophy, it was very much a reaction to the emperor having all the power. And we're not allowed to do much in terms of the public policy realm. So we're having this inward focused like philosophy, and like just do your duty and do what the state says in some ways. But like a lot of people that are in progressive politics that I know have gotten a lot out of it that is in many ways the opposite. That like, know yourself and know what you need to do and do it, and using that to fuel change, which is probably not what Seneca or Marcus Aurelius intended, but I think is great.
Well, we're going to be the Marcus Aureliuses of our time, so it fits, makes sense.
There you go. We're going to have to work on that succession.
Yeah.
Succession, yeah. My ray of hope this week is a book that I've already bent both your ears about because I've just enjoyed it so much, but The Biggest Bluff by Maria Konnikova. And the subtitle is How I Learned to Pay Attention, Master Myself, and Win. And she is someone with a psychology background and has a PhD in psychology, and decided to see what it would be like to try and become a professional poker player, and got one of the best players in the world over the past few decades to like train her as a personal coach, and like sought out all these people and all these people in different disciplines to learn about different ways to read people and different ways in terms of game theory and other methods to make decisions, and wrote about her journey and how she got there, and ended up like within a year winning some big tournaments and like becoming a professional poker player and actually making money. And you know, I found that fascinating, both from like what is the focus of her book, which is the kind of decision making and like how to think aspect, and a lot of that is really how to know yourself and how to set realistic goals and expectations and assess your own performance, which is, you know, nothing more merciless than trying to put that out there on the poker table. But also a lot of her adventures are related to her gender, and men at the poker table where in terms of poker players, only 3% are women, like not taking her seriously, or like not wanting her to be there and going after her in certain ways, and like how that dynamic fit into everything else, and how she overcame that and used it to win.
I like it. I like it.
Could be a good fundraising strategy for us.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you to all 32,000 members of the Maine People's Alliance. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Esther. Folks can ask a question or leave a comment for a future show at 207-619-3182. If you're not watching this online, you will be able to find the video on Facebook and YouTube, and you can follow us on Twitter at MEBeacon. Our theme music is courtesy of Chamberlain.